Welcome. Today we'll be discussing your securing your Copilot deployment with Purview and SharePoint Premium. For more information about today's program, make sure you check out the useful links located at the end of this presentation. So with me today is Scott Derby, our Principal Cloud Strategist here at Planet Technologies, and he has over 15 years of working with Microsoft and their product groups. Welcome, Scott. We're glad that you're here joining us today and on the program.
Thank you, Ken.
Before we get started, I'd love to do a quick poll. So Casey, if you can launch these out for us, we'd really appreciate it. These are all anonymous. So first, we just want to know what type of organization you're coming in from today to join us. And then we'd also like to know, have you started implementing Microsoft Purview? We're going to be talking a lot about this today. So we'd love to know how far you've gotten in your deployment if you've actually started this. So please let us know about that as well. Thank you. So let's quickly go over the agenda today. First, we're going to start with some of Copilot's native protections. Then we're going to talk about best practices for Microsoft 365 data. We're going to go into a Purview overview, SharePoint advanced management, strategies for Copilot readiness, and then questions and then helpful links. And we'll hopefully spend a lot of time answering your questions if you have them. We've got somebody monitoring the chat, so feel free to ask your questions in the chat window, and let's go ahead and get started. So for today's scope, we're talking about Microsoft 365 Copilot and the Microsoft 365 apps. Primarily today, we're talking about what tools can we leverage to identify, protect, and monitor all the data that is in your Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Exchange environments. While there are some tools we will be highlighting today, like Microsoft 365 Purview and SharePoint Advanced Management, we need to remind you that Microsoft 365 is grounded in your data and the context in which you are using it, and that all of your security and governance tools that you have already configured are working hand in hand with Copilot to honor these settings and governance that you've hopefully put in place. Finally, your data is your data and it doesn't leave your tenant boundary, and Microsoft does not use your data to train its models. I'm going to turn it over now to Scott to talk a little bit further on about data security. Scott.
Thanks, Ken. So this is often a question that many people are asking as they're starting to evaluate and look at Copilot. And the question is obviously, what security controls are really in place to help me protect my data? One of the things that we're going to be doing throughout the course of this discussion today is really help you understand some of those tools. But what's first and foremost is to really kind of understand some of the policies that Microsoft has grounded based on, how they've deployed Copilot. So some of the key things to kind of keep in mind, like with many of the Microsoft 365 services, data security is paramount within Copilot. So coming from a top level perspective, highlights to kind of keep in mind, Microsoft 365 and Copilot are ultimately going to recognize the permissions models that you've built inside of your environment today. And they're designed so that you do not unintentionally leak information, whether it's between users within your tenant groups or cross tenants. So these are some of the key things to be, kind of keep in mind as you're doing this. But it also represents some of the importance to why we're going to talk about some of those topics today. Other things to kind of keep in mind is that Copilot's always going to recognize that individual access for those underlying controls. So it's always going to recognize whether or not it's access control lists, permissions on libraries, or whatever policies might be put in place, including things like, for example, information protection and Azure rights management that might be on documents will all be honored inside of Copilot. So with that perspective in mind, let's talk just a little bit around the privacy point of view here. So everything is designed from a privacy perspective, so that's automatically going to inherit our organization's security policies. So those policies that you've defined as part of your overall tenant structure and baseline security policies that are set up within your Microsoft 365 tenant, those are going to be inherited within your Copilot deployment. So those are some of the kind of key things to kind of keep in mind. So these are also reasons why it is really important for us today to really kind of understand what are some of the technologies and tools that we can leverage to be able to look at some of those best practices. So Ken, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Scott. To start, Scott, let's talk about data protection and lifecycle. So quick raise of hands, who remembers Delve? I think we got our first taste of Copilot readiness way back when Delve was released. And we started seeing Delve surfacing up content that we should not have had access to possibly. So what happened next, right? Organizations hopefully started talking about governance and default settings and who should have the rights and to share content. Well, those best practices are still there, and now more important than ever, hopefully training and documentation is also available for your users to know the rules of working in your 365 environment. Data protection equates to information protection and sensitivity. Do I already have the protection for most of my sensitive content in place? Data lifecycle equates to retention. Is your content sites no longer needed? Are they out of date? Is nobody paying attention to them? Are they orphaned? Now let's talk about what should be in your governance plan.
So one of the things.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Scott.
sorry.
Go ahead, Scott.
Oh, so one of the things that you want to look at is really kind of three core tenets from that perspective. And really what it comes down to are the three questions that we're going to ask here is that from a data access perspective, one of the key things that we want to be looking at and ensuring is we aren't oversharing data. Obviously, within the power of the large language models that Copilot brings into play, it can quickly expose a lot of different data that's as it's going through and looking at documents and content within our organization. So it becomes really important to make sure for sensitive information, for critical information, that we don't have documents that are ultimately too accessible. Another component that we often want to look at is really around the sensitivity of this data. I want to make sure that we can always identify content and protect that most sensitive content. And I can't stress this enough for organizations that are having to work in compliant environments in a regulated industry, or maybe subject to regulation controls or security policy or compliance standards, things like CJIS, HIPAA, NIST 800-171, CMMC, just to name a few different standards that are out there. All of this is really now important as we're bringing in Copilot to making sure we can start to really help enable our end users with some really powerful tools, but also making sure that we're remaining compliant at the end of the day as well. And then finally, stale data. We simply want to make sure that we don't have old data silos with outdated information that doesn't exist. We want to get rid of those. Obviously, as we get more and more information into those large language models, as it's starting to ingest more content into that, outdated data, outdated information that is no longer relevant can ultimately impact how accurate and how good the data that is coming back from those large language models is.
So Scott, we got a question from Toby Veneer. I'm not sure if Toby, can you unmute your microphone, or maybe Casey, you could do it for us? Yeah, there he goes. Hey, Toby, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
What question do you have for us today?
Is it because my hand is up?
Yes.
Oh,
I figured
I raised my hand when you asked for hands. Sorry.
Oh, my apologies. We should have taken them all down. Okay, let's continue.
No,
my apologies.
thanks.
Toby. All right, thanks, guys. Let's continue on here and talk a little bit about so just a quick review on what should be in your organization's governance and best practices today. Well, first of all, you should be controlling data access, data protection, and data lifecycle. So some of the things in data access things are your folks managing private and public sites? Is everything public? Is everything private? Managing those site permissions. This is huge. Once you give the keys to the kingdom to somebody, are you actually paying attention? What happens after that? Are you monitoring or auditing them from that point on? Reviewing site permissions. Well, site permissions can change over time. So they don't just stay the way that they are always, right? So you have to have some way to actively take a look at those site permissions from time to time as checks and balances, right? In data protection, are you identifying sensitive content? This is like one of the very first things we need to do. And it was good to see that the survey said that a bunch of folks were already doing this through data classification and sensitivity labels. So that helps with limiting the content exposure, obviously. And then obviously implementing those sensitivity labels, whether they be manually labeled or automatically labeled. Either way, some way of labeling those would be very helpful. And then deleting inactive sites, any site that's up and still has access is fair game for Copilot to find, right? So if there's no reason for Copilot to find something and it's stale data, then we should probably be looking at removing that obsolete data. So just a little bit about some of the things that should be best practices for data cleanliness, because all this is searchable, right? Unless you do specific things, which I'll talk about in a second, to bypass the search engine, all this stuff is fair game for Copilot to find, especially if your permissions or access is off. So I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Scott again to talk about some best practices here.
Sure. So obviously we want to kind of build on some of the best practices that Ken talked about there, but really one of the things that we do is we want to break these best practices down into really kind of two different categories. We're going to be looking at what we want to take on from a more tactical perspective here in the immediate term. And this is what we're going to look at, our short-term practical measures. Much like what Ken talked about, when we start looking at short-term practical measures, we want to make sure that we're identifying sensitive content. Again, this is super critical for organizations that are working in a regulated industry, or they're working in anywhere where they would have a specific compliance standard that they're held accountable to. We also want to make sure that we're looking at and we're getting rid of those old sites. These are probably the first different things that we want to do. And I say old sites, but we also want to be looking at old data. One of the things I saw there, and it's really good to see, is that it looks like about 13% of the organizations out here are using data lifecycle management, part of Purview, which is some of the things we'll talk about. This is a great first step to making sure that we have really good quality content, quality information that are being ingested into the large language models that are ultimately going to be powering Purview from that perspective. So as we start looking at this, then these are just some of the examples I want to do in that short term. Then I want to think long term for a moment. And then when I start looking at long term is I'm going to move beyond just some of these short term tactical practical measures. And I'm going to look at some more industry or enterprise wide initiatives that I want to be taking on. So as I look at that, some of the long term things that I want to be looking at is, how do I start to make life easier for my end users by doing things like implementing auto labeling and setting up particular encryption based on access control lists, based on location, or based on sensitive information types that might be existing within my content. Again, I want to continue to refine a more comprehensive data lifecycle management strategy. We really got to look beyond just deleting old content and getting into a more detailed data lifecycle management. Obviously, this is going to help us not only for a good quality content that is coming in and ultimately out of tools like Copilot, but it also helps an organization remain compliant with a number of policies that are out there. Other things that I might be looking at and considering for highly sensitive information, especially, I work a lot around defense industrial based customers, any customers who are using things like controlled unclassified information or other high level sensitive information. You might start to look at implementing tools like double key encryption. And these are just some of the different things that you'll be looking at and that we'll be talking around. How do I set these from a strategy perspective? So if you think about it, what we want to start with is really a lot of the capabilities that we've set here on the right-hand side of the screen, whether or not we're looking at, identifying sensitive content with Content Explorer and permissions, setting privacy levels on sites and team channels. Are we looking at, making sure that we're limiting overshared sensitive content and ultimately implementing DLP policies? And then as we get into that long term, then we start looking at and leveraging a more comprehensive data lifecycle management strategy. We start to look at implementing auto labeling within tools like Purview, maybe implementing double key encryption, just to name a few different strategies. So.
Awesome. So let's get to the theme, and this is how Microsoft's products work, and this is how we need to look at things here as well. So getting back to the theme of detection, identification, classification, and then protection. Once you have identified the content, then you can protect the content, right? And then once you get that protected content there, then you're looking to move into monitoring and auditing that content. So this is the entrance of where Purview really sits, right? This is the tool that we need to use. That is how you need to think about the best thing you can own. The best thing is that you own some of these tools, right? So whether you're a G3 user or a G5 user, you own these capabilities, so that you definitely own some of these tools. And what we're going to really focus here is on the left side of this screen here, the risk and compliance side, because for the most part, these are where all your Office 365 apps sit, and they're connected to that data there. So that's where we're going to be talking about today. So things like information protection, data loss prevention, and so on. We're not going to talk anything about e-discovery or communications manager or compliance manager, but I could see how they could fit into this plan with Copilot as well. So this is a start of the tools that help starting to detect the data that you have. Microsoft calls this sensitive information types. So sensitive information types start off with things like social security numbers, credit cards. There's over 300 of these templates right out of the box that you can use out of the box, or you can actually then customize them. So let's say you're in the healthcare industry and you have very specific things that are sensitive to you, like, for instance, medical terms, patient names, things like that. So this is under that category of what's called named entities, and they can help you find this data by looking for medical terms, drug names, and then basically these are all built from different systems like the DEA, the DSM-5, ISDN-9, or National Health as well. So even more sophisticated than that, though, if you need to do some specific matching of data that's custom to your environment, you can use something called exact data match. This is especially helpful in healthcare. Think patient records. You can look for content that always contains certain information and then build a template for that document, like a document that always has a birth date or a name or a doctor signature, and then flag that every time you see it for information to cut down on those false positives, which you're going to have some time doing. You can then auto-label it and then use DLP to protect it even further. Going a little bit further with trainable classifiers, this is more for like more nebulous type of identification, things that like you need to flag, like maybe resumes or contracts or abusive language that look like, and you need to like train this manually. Usually it takes about 500 characters just to get started to match what you're looking for. And then there's also out of the box classifiers you can use as well. So basically it looks for patterns, and you have to work proactively to train it to actually do these types of classifiers. Then for credentials, if you're looking for, passwords that are being sent around in email or Teams, or even certificates or passwords that are in zip files, the credential sensitive information types can actually look for those things in your content, in your environments. And then lastly, we have context-based classification. This is the service-side scanning. So this is actually the OneDrive and the SharePoint looking proactively, looking at things like all PDF files or all files that are created by a specific person. You can track and control that. So if you have like VIPs, you can actually proactively track and control all their documents and make them a certain sensitivity type. So this is for identifying or detecting what you have, and the rest, and this is the first step really to protecting your environment. And to do this manually, it would take a while because it's in months and a large team. So you really need to try to use some of these out of the box capabilities. And like I said, regardless of whether you're E3 or E5 or G3 or G5, you have some of these capabilities already available to you at hand. I'm going to turn it over to Scott now to talk about information protection. Scott?
Awesome. Thanks, Ken. So, like Ken said, and like we talked about, we were in a couple of the slides just a few minutes ago, when we start preparing for Copilot, one of the first things that we're going to do is looking at that scanning of that information data. And Ken did a great job of kind of stepping you through what are the different things that are available to help us scan and look at that data and start to understand what data we have within our estate. And this is really, I can't stress enough, a most critical step as we kind of make sure that we're set from a good foundational perspective to have a successful deployment of Copilot. That next step now is let's start to put policies in place to be able to ultimately protect that data. And that's what I'm going to talk about here for a minute here, specifically with Microsoft Purview information protection. Now, one of the things I want to caveat up front is this is by no means required for a Copilot deployment. What we're suggesting here is to really kind of give you guys strategies that are ultimately going to be helping you to have a really solid foundation and a successful deployment of it, but it is not required. So I just want to make sure we kind of set that from a baseline perspective here. One of the things that the Purview information protection is going to allow us to do is that once we understand what that data is within our environment, once we start to look at auto labeling, I can use Purview information protection to be able to set policies around that data. And those policies are going to come in a couple of different things that you saw both in the short-term practical implementations as well as some of the long-term implementations that we can do in our environment. What this allows us to be able to do is effectively implement the data loss prevention policies across the organization. So based on these labels that we can set, we can now define a DLP policies that allows that to be placed on the content wherever it exists within our organization. It doesn't just have to be in one particular place. The next step is really then also putting in place policies that might do things like watermarks on particular documents, document labels that might help kind of define what that particular content is so that it helps our large language models then define where does it place that content, what policies are there to how it shares that content or builds that content into its responses based on the prompts that a user might put in. Some of the things that it's going to do is that it allows us to be able to put encryption around that. And when you put encryption, you'll have two different options that can be set from an encryption perspective. You can have both a view as well as an extract. And the key thing that I want to talk about that was, well, these policies are set by Purview information protection. Those policies are ultimately obeyed and they're observed from Copilot. As an example, if a document does not allow extract on a particular document based, or a policy does not allow for a document to be extracted, for the content to be extracted based on that information protection policy, Purview will not do it. And so these are critical to be able to put on documents that might have sensitive information, whether or not maybe it's HR data, maybe it's payroll information, maybe it's something that might have trade secrets that we want to protect around that. This also then determines where can it be shared across my organizations as well. So this demonstrates just some of the different areas why some of these information protection policies are really helpful and can really provide a really solid baseline for a good, successful, and ultimately a safe deployment of Copilot. Next slide, Ken. Thanks. A couple of the other things to kind of keep in mind is ultimately we want to make sure that we're looking at data lifecycle management. And data lifecycle management is important for looking at content and making sure we're getting rid of that stale content that I talked about earlier. So this is going to be the ability for me to classify, govern that data, but then also put in place policies based on those labels so that if I need to dispose of old data, I can do that. But I also do it in a way that is defensible so that I have very rich audit trails. I can have disposition workflows that function at that level. And ultimately that goes to what we were talking about earlier of having more of an enterprise-wide data lifecycle governance policy. These are really critical and important, not only from your organizational perspective within how you're ingesting that data into the large language models, but ultimately your compliance as well. This is also really key to making sure, hey, we're just getting out there, we're getting rid of old information where users are collaborating so that we're managing that risk and we're preventing any productivity loss. And it can be as simple as deleting old chats to deleting old contents and old documents to ensure that you're ultimately getting a really good response out of Copilot as that pulls that data into those large language models. Now, one of the other things too, when we haven't talked about it, but really the entire Purview platform has a lot of key capabilities to be able to do that. Well, today we've talked here about data lifecycle management, we've talked about classification, and we've talked about information protection. Copilot also works in conjunction with compliance, with insider risk management and doing communication compliance within your organization. And it's going to also work across the entire Purview stack as you look at different tools. So again, the goal here is really going to share just some different strategies and how can you use tools like Purview to help me accelerate a good foundation to be ready for a successful Copilot deployment.
Thanks,
Okay,
Scott.
next slide.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So that's pretty much Purview in a wrap there. Obviously, lots of capabilities. Do you have to use it? We strongly suggest you use it. It would make your life a whole lot easier because otherwise you're just basically hoping that the access permissions on those sites are correct, right? So this is an extra step, making sure that you're using those information protection labels and those data sensitivity labels and the lifecycle stuff to really protect that data. It's another step further. But here's one other tool here. So let's talk about Microsoft Syntex SharePoint Advanced Management, or what they're calling SAM for short. This is part of the new SharePoint Premium license that was just released, and this stuff is really new. Syntex builds on SharePoint to provide premium capabilities for high-volume content processing, extracting metadata, process automation, improving security and compliance, and it builds on the intelligence of the Microsoft Search with links to graph connectors. So for today, we're going to concentrate though specifically on the SharePoint Advanced Management, but SharePoint Premium is much bigger than that. We'll probably end up doing an episode, a Cloud Office Hours in the future on all the capabilities of SharePoint Premium. But for today, we're just going to talk about SAM, SharePoint Advanced Management. So SAM is a Microsoft 365 add-on that provides a suite of features that can help you manage and govern SharePoint and OneDrive, and also enhance Microsoft 365 secure collaboration capabilities. SAM is used by SharePoint admins and site owners, and as long as they have access to the SharePoint Admin Center. That's a key part of this whole thing, because that's where the capabilities exist. So let's talk about SAM, because it has a number of features to detect, take action, automate, monitor, and give you insights into your environment. So for example, let's talk about sharing links are created all the time in your environment, right? And you need to have telemetry so that you can control that oversharing exposure of content. Once you have an idea of what that exposure looks like, we now have some controls that you can put in place to restrict that. So let's take a look at data access governance reports. This is a big one. This one allows you to determine what is the potential oversharing of your sites and files that you have in your tenant. And if you go into that report, you've got a couple reports there that are available, one specifically called sharing links. And in there, you'll see all the different kinds, right? Sharing with anyone links, people in your organization links, and specific people links shared externally. So imagine you're going to a document library and you're going to a document and you're hitting the share button and you want to share it with people in your organization, specific people and so forth, right? So now that person that you just shared with then can forward it to somebody else. And that's where the problem starts and gets a little bit risky, right? Because there's no great way to today of trying to find out what that exposure looks like within your tenant. And that's where SharePoint Advanced Management has the ability to go through all of your sites and your tenant and will give you a count on how many links have been created or shared within the last 30 days. So now you've got the idea to say, okay, let's take a look at one of our sensitivity sites like HR site, where all the payroll information is, and somebody's created 500 links from that site, and they've given, and access is now given out. You need to take control back. And oh, by the way, there's no sensitivity available on that site. So it's a way for targeting specific sites and actually seeing what's going on in your tenant. You've never had this visibility before. This tool will give it to you. Another report that's available helps with lifecycle management, meaning that how many sites are truly inactive in your tenant. So in SAM, you can use built-in processes to do like send an email to the site owner, making sure that they don't need to keep it for whatever reason. And then if they want to delete it, they can go ahead and delete it. But if they don't, you can extend their access for another day, for another 90 days or so. And that capability is all built into the advanced management. All these workflows are built into there. So it definitely helps SharePoint admins deal with the lifecycle issues in their tenants. So in summary, these reports in the data governance reports will help to give you, let you see what the exposure looks like in your tenant. So now you can start taking action on those items accordingly. So now that you have that telemetry insight, you can start using some of the restricted access controls, which is another capability. So one control you can use allows you to set a policy on a particular site, like designate a security group, that only members of that security group will have access to that content, regardless of broken inheritance or any specific permissions you put on that site. So, or if you have sharing links that people set to share with everybody, and you're not in that security group, now you're not going to get access to that content. So think of this new way of doing things like this is like a kill switch. So if you find a site that is just a mess with broken inheritance, sharing is out of control, you can put a kill switch on that by using the security group and only allow people that are in that security group to get access to that SharePoint site. So this is an incredible capability for both proactive and reactive type of work. So this can be used proactively for high sensitivity sites and reactively when you find a big mess that needs to be cleaned up. Another control that we have is blocking downloads. And this is really cool because this has always been hard to do in the past. So imagine that you've got a site where you're wanting to control the information that's being downloaded. So not only can users be prevented from downloading content, but there's a capability of restricting Teams meetings recordings from being downloaded as well. So this is really cool because I know I'm working with a bunch of states right now, and they're kind of worried about Teams meeting recordings, and they really only give it out to a handful of people. This can actually do those exceptions as well in case you need to have those exceptions built in. So just a couple new features that are coming that are a part of SharePoint Advanced Management there. On the automation side of SAM, we have some capabilities like access reviews, apply sensitivity labels to sites, libraries, and even OCR content automatically using some of the information protection plan 2 capabilities integrated into SAM, and you can label at scale. My favorite one here, though, is the apply sensitivity labels to the site. Anything, so once let's say you pull up a site or a library, you can tag that site or library with a sensitivity label, so that anything you drag into that automatically gets that sensitivity label. Anything you create in that site automatically gets that label. And there's some back and forth about, if it has a label going into that site, what takes precedence. Obviously, the higher label takes precedence, obviously. So this can really be a big help and a game changer to making sure that your content and sensitivity labels are applied automatically at the site level, which is really exciting. Lots of things coming soon, and like I said, this is a really dynamic area right now of work being done between the last couple months. There's been a lot of releases going on here. If you look at the helpful links at the end of this the presentation, there's a link to some of these capabilities I'm talking about. So let's talk about for oversharing capabilities and accidental sharing. Let's take a look at content event insights. This includes like alerting notifications and reports on important events taking place, such as like ransomware outbreaks. AI insights, you'll be able to use AI to analyze the SAM reports, and that will provide you insights on that report and recommendations on actions to remedy them. For data access governance insights, you can discover potential oversharing by reviewing content shared within the last 28 days. For data access governance insights, actions, you can mark sites for access review and implement access restriction policies to prevent them and stop them from oversharing. For sprawl control at scale, I like these 2 items specifically. For site policy, you can automatically identify and take control of an ownerless site. And then for inactive SharePoint sites policy, you can make them read-only. So you can mark them as inactive sites and make them read-only. For content lifecycle management, I want to highlight change history and tenant settings. This allows you to audit and review the changes to the tenant settings performed by admins and site owners. So this is a really helpful report there. So now we're at strategies for Copilot readiness. We've talked about a lot of things today, and Scott, feel free to jump in here. But obviously, the first thing that takes place is you've got to have an end user training plan for Copilot, as well as a governance plan in place just in general for your entire environment, right? So having those 2 things is absolutely crucial. People need to know what the rules of the road are, and they need to be trained on how to use these tools, especially what they can and can't do inside their tenants. So having that governance plan not only documented but communicated to your users is absolutely paramount. Understanding and reviewing file permissions and sharing settings and how they have been configured. This is not a one-time done and done, right? I mean, you've got to be monitoring this stuff. You got to be looking at this stuff. You have to have those site owners looking at it. You got to have even another party above them probably looking at it from an auditing perspective. And some of these tools like SharePoint Advanced Management can definitely help with that. Implementing data loss prevention policies. We talked a lot about this. You've got to classify your data, and you definitely need to implement sensitivity labels if you want to protect that data and not trust just access to that data. Implement data governance controls, clean up unused content on orphan sites. Those are risks. Those are like little landmines out there in your environment. So definitely take a proactive look at those, especially the ones that have review share with everyone links. Those are very powerful links that should be definitely taken a hard look at. And then set up default sensitivity labels on libraries, SharePoint sites, and team sites. This could be a huge help for you in protecting all the documents in a specific library, SharePoint site, or team site. And then obviously consider data, in fewer repositories. The less repositories, the less chance of having a risk, right? So review outdated content and sites regularly for orphaned owners and inactive sites. Scott, I don't know if you have anything that you would like to add to these.
No, I think you covered them quite well. I mean, one of the things I will highlight, obviously, the data loss prevention policies are really important as we're looking at kind of making sure that we don't have any, accidental loss of that data. Data governance really is ultimately going to drive us a much more quality output from the large language models inside of Copilot. And as we start to consolidate these data repositories, for those of us who are managing these environments, obviously this just makes our life easier, because the more different data silos we have out there, the more risk we have, the more work it is for us in the end. So just a few different thoughts, but these are ultimately a really good starting point for many of the strategies that we need from a Copilot readiness perspective.
Yeah, and I want to point your direction now, Scott, to one of the questions in the chat window, and it makes a lot of sense, right? So the question is it seems like a lot of these suggestions are setting things up correctly, and you're absolutely right. And they're things that should be done today. But what about the folks who didn't do it correctly and they have years and years of data that might not have been set up correctly? What are your suggestions for that? I've got some ideas. Would like to hear your thoughts too, Scott.
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest things that I would probably start with is really kind of understanding what that estate of data looks like. I think a lot of us are out there within that same type of scenario, right? Especially as we've had a lot of different collaboration tools and an explosion of collaboration tools over the past several years. That's led to an explosion of data. That's no shock. So the biggest thing I would say from that perspective is doing something like Purview and really kind of understanding at least what that data looks like within our environment, to be able to then start to be able to set up a strategy and a path to what are the first things that we're going to be doing. Yeah. The thing I would say in that particular space too is I start looking at a lot of old data. That's where I would say data lifecycle policies are going to become super important to get rid of some of that really old, outdated data, from that perspective. So, and Ken, go ahead and jump in with your thoughts as well.
So definitely some good ideas there, but I go back to that one slide that we had all the sensitivity information types on it, right? Start setting some of those up that pertain to your specific needs. You don't know what's out there until you start looking for these patterns, right? And you can use those tools, those sensitive information types, to go out there and proactively probe your entire environment and see where PII is, see where social security numbers, see where credit cards are, see where whatever you're looking for is going to be, right? So definitely take some time and set up those sensitive information types to start probing your tenant and actually providing visibility into all that sensitive data.
Ken, real quick before we continue,
Yeah.
We have quite a few questions in the Q&A.
Yep.
If we
I'm
can
pulling
take
it up right now. Let's see here.
Thank you.
Okay, so the question from Brett is there seems to be some overlap between Purview and SAM, labeling a site that results in contents inheriting a label. Have you done a feature comparison that includes no, we have not done a feature comparison. And you're right, there does seem to be some overlap, and there's actually, but it's more of a complement, right? So like there's some conditional access capabilities that are allowed to now bridge the gap between Purview and sensitivity labels. So for instance, let's say you have some sensitive content and you want to make sure that you have conditions on that, like that sensitive information can only be accessed via a managed device. Those two things now can be happening, or that you manage that device, has to be managed device, and MFA has to be prompted before you can access that sensitive data. So we're seeing like a marrying of the two of them. They're complementary, and there might be some overlap, but I think we need to take a deeper dive on that one. I don't know if you have any thoughts of that, Scott.
No, I think you summarized that one pretty well. I mean, one of the things I would add into that one is that Purview has a much broader focus around how it's going to do some of its capabilities, where you're seeing some of that overlap, because obviously it's looking at the types of files. It's going to get more deeper into information governance, things like that. And it's really dependent on the types of files. The SharePoint side is going to be a little bit different focus, because it can be more geared towards where data lives in that case. So it does give me a little bit more flexibility on the types of files that I can then protect in that case. So, typical with a lot of Microsoft products, there's always going to be a little bit of overlap, but I think there's also kind of a place for both of them in that particular area. So.
Excellent, excellent. The next question is, can SAM be leveraged against OneDrive and Teams? Absolutely. If you think about it, right, SharePoint is the back end of all this stuff. So as long as you can get access to that back end, SAM can be accessed and be used in there. I mentioned specifically like the Teams, the blocking the download capabilities. That is definitely one that I've read about already, and that it seems to be available in SAM. So yeah, since SharePoint's the back end of all this stuff, you can definitely use it in OneDrive and Teams. When will the next question is, when will the capability exist where I can tell Copilot to label all documents containing SSN numbers by defined confidential label, likewise label sites? Any thoughts about that one, Scott? Or document loggers containing such?
That's a great question. That would be amazing, quite honestly. I don't know that we have any timetable of when a feature like that would be available, but it definitely would make our lives a lot easier, especially when we start looking at, labeling content, managing that content more effectively.
So while Copilot can't do it, right, as long as that you have a sensitivity label identified, you can certainly proactively tag that content then with the appropriate label, assuming you have a G5 license for automatic labeling, right? So that is definitely possible with certain license types.
Yep, absolutely. Well, it's not going to be as rich as kind of what and I think Brett has kind of alluded to by simply telling Copilot to do. It is absolutely kind of capabilities that are there today with the automatic labeling.
Absolutely. Which I would say would be a first start. If you want to know have some visibility into you'd be shocked. I was the tenant owner for many years, and you're shocked when you start, launching some of these sensitive information types, what you'll find in OneDrive especially. So next question is has Microsoft added the ability to natively label PDFs in M365? Yeah, well, yes, actually, I mentioned in SharePoint Advanced Management, in the sensitive information labels, the one that does the service side labeling, you can label all PDFs as a sensitivity label if you wanted to do that. So you can do it by person. So like I mentioned the VIP there, that all their documents should be labeled a certain way. You can do it with all PDFs. So those are definitely capabilities. We've got some more. Looks like Chadwick answered the question about tagging PDFs. So good. Thank you very much, Chadwick, for that one. And then there might have been one more up top here. Okay, I see. All right. So we're moving on, and we're getting close to the end, but just make sure if you have some questions, hold them. We're going to ask for questions in a second, but let's move on a little bit. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, actually, let me go back to the previous slide. So make sure we talked about end user training and governance plan in place. That's absolutely critical. And so this goes hand in hand. So we mentioned the training plays a critical role for the launch of any new service, and specifically users play a crucial role in the success of any launch of service, as well as administrators. So training for Copilot is going to be needed, especially due to the large investment your organization is making in licensing. So things you might want to consider for a successful Copilot rollout are setting up a center of excellence to share experiences and gain feedback on services as they are being offered, as well as especially building a champions program based on personas. Everyone's going to use Copilot differently, and it'd be great for like a champions program or a center of excellence to have that ability to share experiences and best practices, and we can help you with any of those. One of the things that we've learned in past experiences in rolling out new programs like a Copilot, and coupled with our experiences in testing Copilot, we've learned specifically that tailoring training for individual personas in your organization ultimately drives a higher level of adoption. So with that said, we've invested in the persona-based training for Copilot inside our Evolve 365 platform. So if you're an Evolve customer, definitely reach out to our folks and get more information about that. All right, we've got some more questions that I had. Chad, if you can come off mute for a second here, Chadwick, I would appreciate it. We got a question from Stephen Jones about the ease of connecting external data sources, how the data isolation works, SharePoint, email, OneDrive, and does this include MySQL and storage accounts for data locations? This question came in advance, so I don't know, Chadwick, if you can kind of talk a little bit about that. If you're unmuted. Chadwick? Not sure. All right, we'll get back to that question. Chadwick, if you come back to that question, we'd appreciate that. Are there tools that can help us secure our graph information in partnership with our data owners? Well, we talked a lot about them today, right? So anything that's going to be feeding the graph, we mentioned tools like Purview and SharePoint Advanced Management today. Those are definitely tools that can help you with what is being sent to the graph. So definitely consider looking at those. And then we had a bunch of folks saying, and I'll let Scott answer this question because we talked about it in advance a little bit. Are SharePoint Premium and Purview necessary for our Copilot to effectively run? Scott?
I mean, ultimately, the answer is no, you don't necessarily need to have implemented these. We recommend some of these tools as just different ways to help me streamline some of the different strategies that are going to ultimately make it more effective, right? So by no means is this a requirement from a Copilot deployment. There's a lot of ways to do this. There can be a lot of different implementations that can make Copilot successful. What we have found is that these two individual technologies that we've really taken some time to talk about today are great ways to get started. Copilot is based on a lot of the architectures and inherits them natively, so it does make for just ultimately a better together experience.
And even if Copilot wasn't even in this conversation, I would still suggest that these are two tools that should be used just in daily operations of your Office 365, OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams environments. You need this ability and this visibility into sensitive data and access and sharing links and things like that. So that's kind of my 2 cents. Demetrius, did you have a question or does anyone want to say something? No? I saw you come off mute for a second. All right. Looks like we have a question from Charles. You have your hand up, Charles. Go ahead. If somebody can unmute him, that'd be great.
All right. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we did. Yep. Welcome to the program.
Right, thanks. Yeah. I guess my question was, what are the native protections that come with Copilot for Purview? I know we talked about Purview and SharePoint and all that, but I just wasn't really clear on the native protections that come with Copilot. I know you mentioned Copilot inherits our M365 policies and commitments. Yep. What else was there?
Scott, you want to take this? You talked a little bit about some of the inherent stuff some of the inherent protections that Copilot offers.
Sure. So obviously it is going to follow your tenant models. It's also going to follow any of the natural isolation models that are built into Microsoft 365. Anything that you've set up within permissions across there is going to be following through from a Copilot perspective. So as that user is doing, prompts against Copilot, and as that data is returned, obviously it is going to carry across the credentials of that Entra ID, so that based on some of what they have access to. So there are a lot of inherent protections built in from a Copilot perspective. And then natively, Copilot will automatically look at, for example, Purview policies that are set up. So if you have Purview with, an Azure, rights management enabled on a document, that will come across. So if those documents are encrypted, and you do not grant extract rights within that encryption on that, Copilot will not pull that content. So those are just some of examples. Obviously, there's a lot of different ones that are built in there. And the start of it really is ultimately, it will follow your Entra ID credentials and isolations. So.
I hope that helped. Any other questions? Let me go back to the chat.
It
Oh,
did, thank you.
okay, great. We got a long one here with. So the question is, with the nature of research collaboration, we can't necessarily prevent users from sharing files outside of our university. There are a ton of perfectly legitimate business reasons for users to do this. Is there a way to audit report on sharing from OneDrive, SharePoint, and Teams? Yeah, so a lot of the new capabilities in SharePoint Advanced Management will give you that audit capability. Absolutely.
Some of the other audit capabilities too that you can look at there is you can use the communication compliance tools within Purview to be able to look at that, and that will actually open up some additional controls around auditing and putting in what you want to share and what you don't want to share. And that's where kind of setting up some isolation boundaries within that environment would help you. So depending on, as researchers do want to share information, which, is absolutely critical, to help advance that research, there are times too where you might set up where a segment of users in another isolated section of a tenant don't have that. So there are ability to have that delineated policies from that perspective. So.
And then there was a comment about I'd love that there's something like an access review for audits that exists for M365 groups. I'm not aware of that unless it's in the standard audit logs. But not an access review. I have to look into that one as far as where access reviews can be applied, whether it can be on an M365 group or not. So we'll have to get back on you with that. We'll send you a follow-up email, Joseph, on that one. PY or Purview has a great suggestion here. It says it's highly recommended to deploy Copilot in a phased approach, starting with a pilot to identify risks and then learn from that experience. And then who will benefit the most before deploying to the whole workforce? Absolutely. We did not suggest turning on Copilot for every user on day one. Absolutely. It starts with a pilot. It should start with a readiness program to make sure that your risks are identified. You have visibility into what your sharing is like and all the things that are included in a readiness assessment. So definitely take a look at doing a readiness assessment first, and then possibly a pilot. Obviously, it makes a lot of sense. You don't want to do a big bang turnout of releasing Copilot to the Wild West, obviously. Any other thoughts, folks, or questions? Okay, we have one last poll question. We have two more poll questions. One is, where do you see Copilot in your Copilot for Microsoft 365? Let's be specific about which Copilot we're talking about, which was our scope for today, in your set of priorities for this year. So we're looking at now, are you piloting it already? As soon as it's available, possibly in the GCC in late June, possibly, or fall, or this summertime, 3 to 6 months. We'd love to hear from you. And then lastly, the last poll question is, we want to know if this content was useful today for you. So on a scale of 1 to 5, if you could let us know. Save the date for our next Cloud Office Hours. It's going to be March 28th, which is always the fourth Thursday of every month at 1 o'clock. So just a reminder there. And we want to make sure we point out that we've added some new benefits to the YouAlreadyOwnIt workshop. So if you're into Power Platform or just getting into Power Platform, or if you have some questions about licensing, we have a licensing question and answer for Power Platform strategy session, as well as getting started with Power Platform and a deep dive for Power Platform. Please reach out to Michelle McGraw if you're interested in one of those workshops. So at Planet, we want to be your pilot for Copilot. If you have any questions, please reach out to your account executive or cloud strategist. And if you're ready to take the next step and want to talk about readiness or training for Copilot, we're here to help you, as we are a Microsoft Jumpstart partner and for Copilot, as well as a Microsoft AI partner. There's a couple links that I want to point out here specifically that'll definitely get you up to speed quickly on Syntex SharePoint Advanced Management and the introduction of SharePoint Premium for IT admins, as well as the Protect Manage Microsoft 365 Copilot by using Microsoft Purview link. So definitely take a look at those three, since those were the topic of today's discussion. As we wrap up, let's review what we heard today, which is everyone plays a role in securing your content. First, Copilot offers inherent data protections. We talked briefly about how Copilot ensures data is never returned to a user or used by an LLM if the user lacks access to that data. Copilot respects sensitivity labels as applied, and Copilot extends protection to data stored outside your Microsoft 365 when it's opened in an Office app. Administrators need to understand the crucial role they play in securing Copilot data. So with configuration, admins can configure sensitivity labels, retention labels within Purview to align with the organization's requirements. Also, SharePoint Advanced Management can greatly help you with insights and visibility into your sharing and access for OneDrive and SharePoint. And then lastly, for monitoring, you can monitor Copilot interactions, audit logs, and content searches to identify any anomalies or policy violations. You can actually see the prompts of specific users as well. So finally, training, definitely an important component here for getting ready for Copilot. You need to educate your users on sensitivity labels and best practices for handling sensitive data within Copilot. Hopefully that all makes sense. That was a quick summary there. That's a wrap. We hope to see you on March 28th. And we thank you for joining us. And hey, Scott, thanks for joining us today too. We appreciate that. And
Thank
Chad,
you,
thanks
Ted.
for
Pleasure
thank you.
joining.
And then Chad, thanks for manning the chat window. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the 28th of March.